our first Hubspot Hubspot user group for Leeds in March 2018. So my name's Rich. I come from an agency called Six and Flow. We're based in Manchester. We're an inbound marketing agency, obviously Hubspot partner. Been using Hubspot for quite a while now. That's obviously not here to hear me talk about that stuff, but we're excited to be running the Leeds Hub this year. We're looking forward to getting some decent speakers in to talk to you about all manner of things, from sales, marketing, obviously GDPR and everything else that goes along with that. These sessions are designed not for us to kind of ram HubSpot down the throat, but obviously there's an element of that, but it's much more for us to kind of discuss how you use HubSpot, how you use inbound sales, all those kind of elements. So what my hope is, and I think you've probably all seen the email communications, is I'm trying to not just have these events, because these events will be quarterly, these physical events. It'll be, I think the next one is in June. Not just have these, but also try and have a bit of a health community online as well, where we can discuss inbound, we can talk about GDPR, sales, whatever it is. Our ethos as an agency is very much one around how we help, help, because obviously it's that whole pay it forward mentality that always comes back. So we're happy to help with any problems you feel that. So that's enough from me kind of rambling on. I've got two speakers for you today. The first is Michael Buckworth from Buckworth Compliance. There's two parts of the company. He is our go-to guy for anything GDPR. Very, very good speaker. We've had him talk with us in Manchester before. I think you'll find it really interesting what he's got to say, because his take on GDPR isn't kind of doom and gloom. It's much more kind of, this is a great opportunity for businesses in the UK and obviously the EU. And then our second speaker is Ben Cotton from Hubspot. So Ben is lauded as being the kind of go-to guy for sales and marketing alignment, which I think for those of you who are doing anything on automation, have used HubSpot previously and understand the process, it's where it needs to be. If your marketing and sales team are singing from the same hymn sheet, it's a great place to be. So if you'll join me kind of welcoming up Michael to the stage, we'll get going.
Button behind my glass.
Can anyone see the mouse?
This is why you don't let tech guys deal with tech, right?
Got it. We're good.
Yeah, just
Cool.
So good afternoon. Oh, good morning even. I'm way ahead of the game today. So obviously we're going to talk a little about GDPR and sort of the idea really is to run through some of the stuff that is sort of most relevant. GDPR does an awful lot of things. There's lots of detail to it. My view is that a lot of this is just incremental change. So there's lots of stuff in the press about how we're all going to get massive fines, the world's going to end, it's going to be a nightmare. Clearly, if you're Facebook, then that's probably the case. But in principle, it really shouldn't be a massive issue. It's really incremental. It's a fairly logical, sort of common sense change, and I think the important thing is that people need to understand what they need to do and become compliant with it. So broadly, this is going to be a relatively positive sort of overview. Before we start, a bit about us. So I am a lawyer, set up Buckworth back in 2011, and we are the only law firm in the market who work exclusively with startups and high growth businesses. That basically makes it pretty cool. We work with lots of the sort of startups and businesses on the trendy end of the spectrum. Our regulator, obviously SRA, System Regulation Authority, they don't like compliance very much. So what they pretty much said to law firms about 12 months ago is, we don't really want you guys to do the compliance work. We want that to be done separately, and basically we don't want to regulate it. So what a lot of law firms have gone and done is they've set up a separate business which deals with the compliance. So for us, the law firm is maroon, it's called Buckworth, and the compliance firm is blue, and it's called Buckworth Compliance. We lawyers, we don't have much imagination when it comes to branding. We basically sort of can help with all the GDPR stuff, all of the compliance, and we'll talk through some of that at the end. So, what are we covering? We're going to start off by talking a little bit about backgrounds. Where's this come from? Why is it relevant? We're then going to have a talk about consent, which is one of the sort of main sort of things that is changing and is probably most relevant to all of you. Apply it a little bit to sort of generic business. Obviously, there's lots of different people doing different things here, so we'll be a little bit generic about it. And finally, just finish off with an idea of what you need to do to become compliant. So, what's the background? As you guys probably know, data protection is currently governed by the Data Protection Act. Now, that was passed 98. It came into force in 2000, so quite a long time ago. In the UK, it's been pretty shockingly enforced. The level of compliance has been really, really poor. The best way I can give an example of this, there was a US company who set up a Spanish subsidiary. It came to court a couple of years ago. They set that Spanish subsidiary up. It was all compliant with data protection laws. They did everything right. They got hacked, and unfortunately, they didn't tell the regulator fast enough that they'd been hacked, and they didn't make any public announcements about it. Now, in Spain, the directors went to prison for a year and each got fined €100,000. Now, pretty much exactly the same thing happened in the UK with a telecoms company a couple of years back, and there was, I think it was a £50,000 fine for the company. So you can see there's a massive difference in enforcement throughout the union. Now, one of the ideas of GDPR is to harmonise that sort of level of compliance across the union and harmonise the penalties if something goes wrong. So GDPR comes from Europe, European regulation. Something just to be aware of, it's been very, very heavily championed by the UK. So the question always comes up here, Brexit, do we need to worry about it? Brexit's going to happen soon, GDPR is going to go away, right? Sadly not. Firstly, GDPR comes into effect in May. It's not going to disappear after that, regardless of Brexit. And the British government have made it very clear they're not intending to depart from the GDPR approach. Actually, as we'll talk about a bit later, there is an expectation that the UK government may go further than GDPR in a couple of areas. So here to stay, don't ignore it because of Brexit. There are two other bits of legislation that we must not forget. So GDPR is the one we're all focusing on, but there are two others. First is e-privacy. So if you remember the cookies law, a couple of years back, we were all freaking out about cookies and what you had to do to be compliant with that regulation. That came from e-privacy. Now, e-privacy is currently being updated. There's a bit of a scrap in the European Parliament about it, but theoretically it will come, the updated version will come into force in May, around about the same time as GDPR. But the second one is PECA, so the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations. For those of you who do marketing, so if you're sending out marketing emails, you hopefully are aware of this. If you're not aware of it, you probably are compliant with it, or you should be compliant with it. So this regulates basically sort of direct marketing. The best example of compliance is if you think about setting out your let's say your monthly mailing list, there will be a link at the bottom to opt out of receiving further mails. That basically comes from one of the obligations in PECA. So those two bits of legislation still in effect, remain in effect going forwards, and you shouldn't forget them when dealing with the GDPR compliance. I thought I'd include a little bit of why is this a good thing. For what it's worth, I actually genuinely believe that GDPR is broadly pretty good for business. The first one is the statement of the obvious. So GDPR basically updates a bunch of really outdated laws. Google, to put this into context, Google was incorporated in 1998, I think September. So at the point where legislators were thinking about the Data Protection Act, and in fact passing the Data Protection Act, basically Google didn't exist. So imagine a world pre-Google. It's a pretty different world to where we are today. GDPR basically is attempting to update laws that are out of date and don't reflect the world we live in. That's got to be a good thing. The second one is that, as I said earlier, GDPR is intended to provide a level playing field across the union so that businesses can have an expectation that the data protection rules, the same rules will apply in each jurisdiction. I would say that's pretty good for us with Brexit coming up. What it means is that the UK, with one of the biggest digital economies in Europe, is going to have a level playing field with other jurisdictions. What was a concern when Brexit happened, and I think misguided, was an idea that you would have a UK regime that perhaps was more onerous than a European regime, and we would therefore be in a less good position to European companies. But GDPR hopefully sorts that one. The final one is the most important thing. Being compliant with GDPR is an opportunity. It's a great opportunity to talk to your customers, re-engage with them, tell them what you're up to. But it's also the case that businesses that are compliant have a competitive advantage. Now, I would actually now, having done too much GDPR compliance with clients, I would actually go further than that and say businesses that are not compliant in the next couple of years won't be here. So what I mean by that, we are seeing some of our big corporate clients having conversations with their suppliers and saying, are you GDPR compliant, or do you have a pretty damn good plan to be compliant? If you're not, we're not working with you. It's too much of a risk for our business, therefore you can go and we'll just replace you. So my view is that businesses that haven't thought about compliance just won't be around the next couple of years. So, other than consent, we'll talk about in a sec. What's changing? I think the first big ticket change is the definition of personal information. So the really big point is that business contact details are now included in the context of personal information. So currently, and as a lawyer I sort of shudder to say it, but currently you can theoretically get away with spamming business email addresses, and you can view them as being outside of the data protection regime. From May, they are very much inside the regime, and so anything you do with business contact details must be compliant with GDPR. More out of interest, one of the updates, we now have a specific inclusion of the definition of personal information of genetic data and biometric data. In practice, businesses dealing with that data have assumed it's personal anyway, but it's now specifically included. There are two new rights that are coming into effect. The first one, the right to be forgotten, this is the right of erasure. I actually think this one is potentially quite problematic for a lot of businesses. So what it means is, in certain circumstances, if a data subject wants their data to be deleted, then you have an obligation to delete the data from your systems. The sting in the tail is that you also have an obligation to make sure it's deleted from the systems of anyone you disclosed it to. So let us say you've collected, let's take a really easy example, you've collected an email address, you have put that into MailChimp, you provided it to Six and Flow, you've sent it to XYZ other person. When that erasure request is made, if you choose to meet the request, you have to make sure that it's deleted in all of those places. Or you have to have been explicit as to why it won't be. And we'll talk about that in a sec. So that's something that requires you to understand where the data sits. You need to understand what you do with data in your business. Now, before you all freak out and go, this is a nightmare, it only applies, the erasure requests only apply in three circumstances. So the first one is where there's no compelling reason for the data to be processed by you. So the best example of this would be, you've been working with a customer, you've finished working with them, you've terminated the agreement. You may not need the data you hold about them any longer. Now, it may be you do, but it may be you don't. So at the point that you no longer need the data, you should automatically be deleting it going forwards. And this is something called the data minimization obligations. So the rationale basically being you should only have the data that you need, and you should only have it for as long as you need it. And we'll talk a bit more about data minimization at the end. So that's the first one. You don't need to have the data any longer. The second one, I'm going to jump to the final one. The second one is that you shouldn't have had the data in the first place. So basically, let's imagine that you have bought a dodgy mailing list of email addresses. The people who are on that mailing list have not given consent to be on it, they shouldn't be on it in the first place. Your use of that information is under GDPR illegal. Self-evidently, the data subject can require you to delete that data. So that one, fairly straightforward. Now the final one is basically that the data subject withdraws consent. Now, under the current regime, that most businesses assume that the reason that they're collecting data and the reason they're doing stuff with data is based on the consent of the data subject. So a lot of businesses, they have their privacy policy. The privacy policy says, we do all of this stuff with your data, click here to give your consent to us doing that. So there's an assumption it's all based on consent. Now, as we're going to talk about in a sec, consent is a lot more difficult to secure, and it's a lot more problematic to rely on it. So actually, you're likely to rely on other reasons for processing data. Best example would be, for example, contractual performance. So what that means is that you need to process the data in order to provide your goods or services. Where you're relying on consent, so only where you're relying on consent to process the data subject can withdraw their consent and require you to delete that data. What does that mean in practice? You don't want to rely on consent. And we'll talk about the processing conditions in just a sec. So that's the right to be forgotten. The second new right of data portability, for me this is more just of interest. I don't know if you guys have come across open banking, but it's basically this idea that you can move your banking information from one provider to another. So you may bank with NatWest, you've got all of your banking information sat on your online profile, you can see all your transaction history. Historically, NatWest would not let you take that data with you in a machine-readable format. So yes, you could print bank statements, but you couldn't download it to a spreadsheet and then move it across to, let's say, HSBC. With open banking, that data is now movable. And so what it means is you can move it to your next bank, you can put it into fintech software and you can analyze it. The data can be moved from service provider to service provider. This is the same basic concept. So GDPR is saying we want data subjects to be able to move their personal data from one service provider to the next. The interest from my perspective on this one, it's not terribly well defined. It's very much an early stage concept. It's mandatory to allow people to do it, but basically you don't have to make it terribly easy. So there's no obligation to build in sort of automated systems into software that allow people to do this. You can just get them to email you and request any information. When we do events with the regulator, this is the right that they're actually quite enthusiastic about and they're quite excited about. And their view is that there will be further legislation on this in the next couple of years, and that they think the right to data portability will become much more detailed and much more binding on businesses going forwards. So if you guys are thinking about future developments, being ahead of the curve, my suggestion would be data portability and building mechanisms for that is probably one of the things that will be relevant soon. So that leads us neatly onto consent. So before we get onto the detail, let's just quickly run through the background on this. So GDPR applies to businesses that are established in the European Union. So if you've got a business in the UK, it applies to you. But also businesses established outside the Union who are providing goods and services to data subjects in the Union. So let's imagine you are a US company, you are selling widgets to, I don't know why lawyers always use widgets, but I don't even know what a widget is actually, but you are selling widgets to people based in the European Union, GDPR will apply to you. The definition of offering goods and services is really broad. Targeting goods and services to people in the Union, delivering goods, publishing websites tailored to the EU market, or taking payments in the European currency, all of that basically means you're caught by GDPR. So, if you are subject to GDPR, you have to do two things. Firstly, you have to comply with you have to comply with what are called the 6 principles. And secondly, for every processing activity you undertake, you must satisfy at least one of the processing conditions. So, the 6 principles, I would say, relatively common sense. So you need to process data lawfully, fairly, and transparently. What that means in practice is you need to tell people what you are going to do with their data. So jumping onto Facebook and their current problems, we don't really know what's gone on. We don't know whether they've done something wrong or not. But it looks like what potentially happened is that they were collecting people's data for one purpose and then using it for a bunch of other purposes. Under GDPR, you can't do that. You have to be explicit about what purposes you're going to collect data for and what you're going to do with it. Secondly, it has to be specified, explicit, and legitimate. In principle, it's the same sort of point. You need to be explaining what you're going to do with the data. It has to be adequate, relevant, and limited. So this is really important. You shouldn't collect data that you don't need. So in going through data protection compliance with a number of our clients, I say all of them probably, have collected way more data sets than they really need. There's this idea that you collect a bunch of data, you might be able to become a big business, a big data company in the future. So let's collect all the data we can get. It may be useful going forwards. That justification does not work going forwards. You only collect the data that you need, and you should expect to be required to justify why you need it. Data must be accurate. Now, this is something that already applies. It's already the case under the Data Protection Act, but it is just worth remembering. You have an obligation to make sure the data that you store is correct, and that is a positive obligation to update. So we'll talk about keeping data and how long you want to keep it for in a sec, but one of the issues of keeping data for a long time is you have an obligation to make sure that it's updated regularly so it's accurate. It is a breach of GDPR to keep data that is inaccurate and to effectively to not update it. As we said earlier, you have to retain it no longer than necessary, and you have to store it securely. So as I say, 6 principles, in theory, fairly common sense, but there's a little bit of detail around them. So the processing conditions, for each activity that you undertake, you must meet one of the processing conditions. So as I said earlier, most businesses currently assume that consent is their processing condition. Consent's changing a lot. We'll talk about that in 2 secs. But there are other processing conditions that are relevant and that I would suggest you should be trying to use. So the first one, contractual performance. This covers most of what you do in your business. So, the classic sort of comment people make when it comes to us is they say, can we carry on sending emails to our clients if we don't have their consent? Yes, you can if it's contractual performance. So we as a law firm, we have to email our clients to communicate with them, set up meetings, send them drafts of documents. All of that stuff is contractual performance. You don't need consent to do it. It's just allowed because you need to do it for your services. Legal obligation covers, for us, the best example, when we take on clients, we have to do money laundering checks on them. So in order to do money laundering checks, we have to get a copy of passport, utility bills, that kind of stuff. The reason we collect that information is legal obligation. We have to collect it to meet our requirements under law. Now, interestingly, we will then delete it immediately. So we do the money laundering check, we then delete the passport. Because the reason we collected it was to do the money laundering check. Once we've done that, we no longer need that passport copy. We talked about consent. There's a bunch of others I'm not going to go into, but I am going to just touch on legitimate interest. Now, for those of you thinking about marketing activities, which we'll talk about in a sec, legitimate interest is quite important. Now, what this means is that it's in the interest of your business to do an activity, so to use data in a certain way. The way you're using the data is a way that wouldn't surprise the data subject, and the use of the data doesn't harm the data subject. So what does that mean in practice? Best example I can think of. Let's say that you are ASOS. You have people coming onto your platform, they look at the products, they look at stuff to buy. So what you do is you track Jane blogs as she comes onto the platform. You look at the products she's looking at, and you see that she is looking at floral bikinis. Now, you think to yourself, okay, she's looking at floral bikinis. It's the middle of winter, it's been snowing outside. Unless she's a lunatic, she's probably going on holiday somewhere hot. So what we're going to do is we're going to send her a nice email, and we're going to send her sunglasses and sun hats, and we're maybe going to send her a nice floral dress because she appears to like flowers. That activity of sort of collecting that data and analysing it is called profiling. Now, legitimate interest is in most cases going to be the basis for doing that profiling activity. So going back to the basics of what legitimate interest is again, is in the interest of your business. Clearly it is. Being able to send that email to Jane is a good thing. It's something she would expect. Again, you've probably said in your privacy policy that this is something you're going to do. And in any event, it's probably something that she wouldn't be surprised about. And it doesn't harm her. Now, the harm point is a slightly tricky test. You need to be a little bit careful on it. The best sort of example on this one I can think of is recruiters. So my inbox every morning is spammed with emails from recruiters telling me that I desperately need to meet this candidate because they're an awesome lawyer. They can probably rely on legitimate interest if the candidate they're sending me is relevant to my business. So if they are sending me, let's say, a 2-year qualified data protection lawyer, they can probably just about get away with legitimate interest. If, as very, very often happens, they are sending me a criminal lawyer, we don't do anything criminal, they're sending me a criminal lawyer, they ain't going to be able to rely on legitimate interest. The regulator takes a view that wasting people's time sending them stuff that is not relevant to them harms their rights. So because of that, legitimate interest doesn't work. So why have I said that consent is a problem going forwards? A couple of reasons. GDPR changes the definition of consent. The first change, or the first highlight actually, is that consent must be freely given. So, in other words, you can't say to your data subjects, unless you consent to this, you can't use our platform. If you're forcing people to consent, it's not freely given. Secondly, you can't use omnibus consent. This is the bit that is going to make UX guys cry. So if there's anybody crying next to you, they probably work in user experience. What this means is that for each processing activity in which you rely on consent, you have to have a separate consent given. So if you're doing stuff online and you're doing 5 different processing activities using consent, that will be 5 separate tick boxes. And now you can see why I say you don't want to use consent, because obviously if you use contractual performance or one of the other processing conditions, people don't need to tick a box. If you're using consent, they do need to tick a box, and they have to do a separate tick box for each processing activity relying on consent. And then the final big point, pre-ticked checkboxes do not work. For what it's worth, they've never worked. They don't work under the current regime, but people still optimistically use them. To be absolutely clear, they do not work going forwards. So people need to, if you're doing stuff online, they need to actually click a box that is unticked to start with to give their consent for the processing activity. Obviously, with consent, you need to be able to record that the person's given consent. And HubSpot have a wonderful product that enables you to do that, and they're going to talk about that later, I'm sure. But being able to record that consent is really important. So, how does this apply to direct marketing, which is the area that I think most people become concerned about? There are 2 types of direct marketing from, if you like, a legal perspective. The first one is the easy one. So this is your sort of regular email update. So let's say you send a monthly newsletter to your customers. In order to send that email, you almost certainly need consent of the data subject. Now, that consent needs to be compliant with GDPR. So if, as a lot of businesses have done, you have got a consent for direct marketing, but it's an omnibus consent. It's been a tick at the end of a privacy policy to give consent for that and a whole load of other stuff. In all likelihood, that consent is no longer valid. So what you now need to do before the end of May is go through your CRM, go through your database, and get valid GDPR consents from as many people as possible. What I would say, I think the initial reaction of clients who are reliant on sort of consent and reliant on being able to send direct marketing emails, the initial reaction is one of horror. We've got a database of 20,000 people. We simply can't get 20,000 consents in that period of time. What I would say is, actually, for people with that size of database, when you really stop and think about it, if you track the sort of emails that are going out, you're not getting any response from a significant chunk of those people. There's no point having them on the database if they're not engaging with you. Therefore, this is a great opportunity to actually enrich your database and get a database that is more valuable. I think the second thing is that clearly having a sort of sensible campaign, making sure that you're trying to get consent in a way that is most likely to get it is important. There's a man at the back called Rich who could probably help you with that one. I know nothing about marketing, but what he says is incredibly logical. So that is basically the sort of the straight newsletter email consent, email marketing. There is a second type of marketing, which basically puts profiling on top. So if we go back to the ASOS example, it's basically that. So it's profiling your user and then sending them a targeted email that meets their requirements based on what you collected about them. Now, as I said earlier, that profiling is a separate activity to sending the email. So for those more targeted communications, what you're looking at is 2 processing activities. Consent to send the email in the first place, and then probably legitimate interest to do the profiling. Where's the line draw? Where do you draw the line on marketing emails, not marketing emails. You need to think about it. In the context of doing the analysis and putting in place things like data protection impact assessments, there is some scope to actually sort of put down the thinking as to whether an email communication is a marketing email or not. What we have tended to say to clients is, if the email relates to service provision, so you're sending an email to somebody about service provision, then that is probably covered by contractual performance or potentially legitimate interest, even if it has a degree of marketing bent to it. So the best example is, one of the ways that you can try and get consent once GDPR comes into effect is actually to send, so let's say you've met a customer at a trade show, you've got their business card, you don't have an explicit consent from them to add them to your marketing database. You talk to them about entering into a contract with you to do business with you, perhaps you do some business with them. In the context of perhaps sending them the final work product or agreeing fees or something, you send them an email saying, let's say it's fees, here's our invoice, amazing to work with you. If you would like to receive further information about what we do and to be added to our marketing list, please tick this box. So it's a service provision email, but it gives you the ability to sort of get those opt-ins for marketing purposes. So, what are the things that we think about when sort of applying this to businesses? The first one we've already talked about. It's making sure you understand what your processing conditions are. So, in short, for every processing activity that you undertake, you need to identify the processing condition that you're relying on. That needs to be recorded. It's generally recorded in something called a data protection impact assessment, which we'll talk about in a sec. But you need to make sure that you have gone through that thinking and you know what process condition you are relying on. Secondly, one of the obligations of GDPR is to store data securely and to process it securely. So now is a great opportunity to look at the technological protections you have in place for your data. Some of that, a lot of that, is talking to service providers, understanding what they can do to help you with your compliance, understanding what's encrypted, what isn't encrypted, what form of encryption platforms are using, and what they need to be doing. There's a couple of sort of observations from the legal side on this. The first one is you are allowed to take a risk-based approach on this. If you are processing huge quantities of very sensitive information, so let's say about people's illnesses or something like that, then you are required to have in place more robust protections than if you are just processing, let's say, email addresses. So the risk-based approach does apply. By the way, that does not mean that you can say, yeah, what we're doing is not terribly sensitive, let's not worry about it. There are sort of minimum obligations, but just because your next door neighbour has got sort of nuclear power station levels of encryption and security doesn't necessarily mean that you need it. They may be doing something slightly more sensitive than you are. The second thing is, in our experience, when we have looked at situations where clients have got compliance wrong, the technology bit is often not the problem. It's often that they're, on a practical level, they haven't got stuff right. So the best example would be, we have a medtech client processing extraordinary sensitive information. Actually, their tech stuff's pretty good. Everything's encrypted, they've thought about it, they've got it right. But when we actually went and sat down with them, they use a bunch of software that is not password protected on their computers. And some of their team don't even have password protection on the computer itself. So you can literally just walk into the office, tap the keyboard, get straight into the computer and straight onto the database. Bluntly, it doesn't matter how encrypted and how secure the software is. If you've got people leaving computers completely unsecured, you have a huge problem. You're not in compliance. So absolutely look at that technology stuff, make sure it's done right, but really also focus on the practical stuff and making sure that you've got systems in place and rules that keep data securely. For what it's worth, most of the biggest breaches and most of the biggest fines in the UK market the last 5 years or so have actually been people doing stupid stuff. It hasn't really been technological problems, it's been people doing stupid stuff. One of the weirdest examples is actually one of our clients. You're familiar with Gumtree, some of the platform website. Not our clients, but our client does something quite similar. Weirdly, one of the biggest revenue streams for those sorts of platforms is the personal ads, by which we basically mean prostitution. they had an employee who left the business. And weirdly, he downloaded a huge quantity of data from the escort ads. And then even more bizarrely, he wrote to them anonymously, said, I have this data, unless you pay me lots and lots of money, I'm going to release it. Now, he got arrested pretty quickly, but one of the problems the business had was they had got a whole chunk of really quite sensitive data sets floating around, didn't know where it was, they didn't know who had got it. And they were sitting there thinking, there's a bunch of very worried husbands floating around, or there would be if this got out, a bunch of very worried husbands floating around. Now, because they didn't know what had happened, they didn't know who had got it, they didn't know where it was, they had to tell the regulator. It wasn't the UK regulator, it was a foreign regulator who basically didn't know what to do with it, which was also quite weird. Long and short of it was, it all got solved. He had just basically taken it and put it in his bedroom drawer, hadn't actually done anything with it, so it was all fine. But that kind of stuff is a problem. Now, what the regulators came back with eventually was sort of two things. They said, firstly, you guys should have known the minute he downloaded that data. It shouldn't have taken him to blackmail you for you to suss that data had got out. So you should have had log controls and that kind of stuff on your platform. And secondly, he shouldn't have been able to download the data in the first place. It should have been a locked system, and if you need to take stuff off the system, it should require a director consent or something like that. So sort of fairly basic stuff would obviously materially improve the situation. I'm talking very briefly about data minimization. We sort of touched on it earlier. The principle here is that basically you should only collect the data that you need, and you should only keep it as long as you need it. Statement of the obvious, sounds straightforward. It is a bit of a problem in practice sometimes to work out how long you need data for. Now, some of you may know, the ICO, the regulator, they have a helpline. You can call up and ask them questions. They are very helpful, but unfortunately they come out with some slightly simplistic answers. And if you ring them up and say to them, we intend to keep data for 12 months after the customer ceases to do business with us, I'll bet you a Mars bar they tell you that's not GDPR compliant, and they will say something like 3 months. It's rare that one says this, but just ignore them. As far as I can figure out, and I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but I think what's happening is they have people sort of with a sort of FAQs thing, and they're basically giving sort of approximate best case scenario advice. How long you keep data for is business specific. So you guys need to figure out for your business, how long do you need it for? Now by need it, I don't mean how long do you want to keep it for, it's how long do you genuinely need to keep it for. So for us as a law firm, we are required by our regulator to keep all records on clients, most records on clients, for 6 years. And that's because we can be sued for 6 years after we give advice. So for us, our retention policy starts at 6 years, and it may go up or down from that for most of the things that we process. You know, it might be that for an e-commerce platform, you need to keep, certain data, perhaps in relation to warranties, that kind of stuff, for the period of the warranty. That might be 2 years. But it might also be that once a customer deletes their profile with you, you don't need to keep some of that data at all. So if we go back to our ASOS example, they may need to keep a list of the products you bought for, let's say, 2 years, but they may not actually need to keep the profile they built about you, so the fact that you're called Jane and you like your floral bikinis, they may not need to keep that at all. In practice, they probably delete that straight away. So for each data set, you just need to go through, think how long you need to keep it for, and record that logic. We'll talk a little at the very end about documentation. One of the key things that the regulator has said repeatedly is that you must record your logic. What they're looking for if they come and investigate, they're looking for evidence you've thought about this stuff, you've done your best to be compliant. So when it comes to data minimization, there's a fair chance the regulator may not agree with your analysis because in all likelihood we think they're going to be a bit more aggressive than the market. But the point is, if you've written that analysis down and it's not completely out there, in all likelihood what they're going to do is say to you, we don't agree, please change your approach, as opposed to fining you. If you haven't recorded the logic and you appear to be making it up as you go along, you're much, much greater risk of receiving a fine. The final sort of topic I'm going to talk about before we get on to what we have to do to become compliant is just disclosures outside of the European Union. GDPR applies throughout the union. If you process data or you disclose data to people outside of the union, then you have some enhanced obligations. The first one is essentially to make sure that the country that you are disclosing the data to has an equivalent regime to the European Union. So the best example would be the US, the US data shield. That is broadly equivalent to the UK. Some specific rules about how you deal with the US, but in principle, those disclosures are fine. If you're transmitting data to a country that doesn't have an equivalent regime, you must make sure that there are contractual obligations in place that have equivalent to the European regime. What I would say, if you're transmitting data outside of the EEA, there are some standard clauses that you should be putting in contracts, but actually talk to a lawyer about it because it can get very complicated very fast. So I think if that's what you're up to, definitely have a talk to somebody. Worth saying, it is a sensible thing to be doing at the moment to just be asking your data processors, so people you provide data to, where their servers are based, where they are based, whether the data leaves the European Union. You do have an obligation to know that, so it is worth just to be clear on it. So then, last thing, what do we have to do now to get compliant? I view compliance as sort of two parts. The first bit is becoming compliant. So this is what we have to do now to get ourselves ready for May. And the second bit, and as important, is remaining compliant. GDPR compliance is not a tick box exercise. It's not about doing all the forms, putting the policies in place, and then completely forgetting about it and saying, yippee, you were done. You have to keep looking at this stuff. You have to make sure that on an ongoing basis, your business is compliant. Whilst we're at it, the other thing that you should be careful about is looking at sort of service providers, looking at Google, looking at Facebook, well, probably not looking at Facebook, but looking at other platforms, and them saying, we are compliant with GDPR. Just because your service providers are compliant doesn't mean you are compliant. You want to use, obviously, businesses that are compliant. That's hugely important. And that obviously people like Hubspot can help you become compliant. They can provide services that make your compliance, make you more compliant, make it easier for you to comply. But you still have to understand what you're doing, and you still have to understand all the things that we've talked about. So I think the key one here is the obligation is on you, not on your service providers. So you have to understand it, and then obviously use service providers who can help you and who are compliant. So what do we have to do? For most businesses, the starting point is something called a data protection impact assessment. It's basically like a mini audit. We're sitting down and working out what data you collect, what you do with it, where you store it, and if there's anything funky that you're doing that probably you shouldn't be doing. That theoretically generates an understanding of what you're up to, and it generates an analysis of where you're not doing stuff right or where stuff needs to improve. On the back of that, we put in place some compliance policies. The good news is those are relatively standard. There's a little bit of tweaking per business, but most of it's quite standard. We update your privacy policy. We're finding with clients that update is quite significant in most cases. And then we have a look at your technological side. So a lot of businesses, there's a little stuff you can do to improve your technological security and improve your compliance. To the extent that you guys are doing stuff that is more sensitive, I would actually loosely say this is a good opportunity to get penetration testing done. So this can be done at a bunch of different levels, but it's effectively ethical hackers coming in and trying to hack into your platform. We've found clients have done it. It's often not very expensive. It's actually been quite illuminating to them as to where the weaknesses are. So potentially something to think about there. The sort of final point on this is just around insurance. So if you are a cyber insurance broker, now is a lovely time for you because you're sending out lots of communications to people saying you need cyber insurance, GDPR insurance, all this kind of stuff. GDPR, I kind of think is not hugely relevant to it, but it's a very good opportunity to have a look at your cyber insurance policies. Really what you're thinking about is a couple of things. Firstly, if you get a ransomware attack, so somebody takes control of your computer or your platform, you need to make sure that you can deal with that as fast as possible. So the insurance companies will provide you with, helpful expert people to deal with those sorts of problems and to try to get access to your software back again quicker. Now, of course, one of the ways to avoid that being a huge issue to your business is to make sure that everything is backed up on the cloud, so using cloud software, all that kind of stuff. That helps to reduce the risk if something awful happens. So that's the sort of first thing. Second thing, if you're investigated by the regulator, a lot of cyber insurance will pay out the cost of the legal fees and that kind of stuff to deal with the investigation. That I would say is probably worthwhile. Those investigations can be quite expensive. Now, the third one's a little bit controversial. My view is that cyber insurance does not pay out for fines issued by the regulator. Every so often people tell me this isn't true, and there is cyber insurance out there which claims it will pay the fines. But when we've looked at the small print on those policies, it seems to me that they only pay the fines if you have been compliant with the law. And on a simplistic interpretation, you ain't going to get a fine if you're compliant. So it seems to me that GDPR fines are not covered by insurance. And I would strongly suggest you just take that view anyway. If you do get fined, you get them covered, great. So once we are compliant, we then have to maintain our compliance. And from our perspective, I think there's a couple of things that are worth doing. The first one, regular quarterly updates. This doesn't need to be hugely complex. You know, half-hour sit down with management, customer services team, people involved in the business, to just check that nothing weird and wonderful has happened in the past quarter. You're not about to introduce new services that will change your analysis. You know, make sure that there's no learning that should be picked up. You know, all of that kind of stuff. Most important thing, write it down, put it in a compliance file, so if the regulator comes knocking, you can demonstrate that you've been thinking about this kind of stuff. Second thing, training. So this comes back to my point earlier. You can have the most wonderful policies in place, you can have lots of technical stuff, but if your employees are leaving unlocked laptops on trains, you're going to have a problem. So making sure that your employees understand what they're doing, hugely important. The final thing really on this one is just breach management. So one of the newish obligations of GDPR is an obligation to report to the regulator within 72 hours of a breach that poses a high risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. So basically, there's a data breach, data gets lost, leaked, something happens. You have an obligation to tell the regulator within 72 hours if it's, for want of a better word, a serious breach. Now, that's 72 hours from the point at which you become aware of the breach, or crucially, the point at which you should have become aware of it. If you don't report to the regulator in that time, you are likely to be hit with a pretty hefty fine. So the basic position is you tell the regulator within that period if you need to. You should get advice within that period, and that period, for what it's worth, covers weekends. So it's not working hours, it covers weekends as well. My advice to clients on this kind of stuff, absolutely tell the regulator, even if you're not quite sure what's happened, but only tell them what you know. So we had a client a couple of years back who they knew they had a breach. They went along to the regulator without telling us and said to the regulator something along the lines of, we've had this breach, this data has been lost, we think XYZ happened. Now they said that in good faith. It transpired that XYZ did not happen at all, and it was something completely unrelated. When they went back to the regulator 2-3 weeks later, as agreed, and they said to the regulator, yeah, what we told you was not right, actually this happened, the regulator was not a happy bunny at all. They immediately thought something was up and that the client was doing something wrong. So my advice is only tell the regulator what you know. They don't expect you to know everything within 72 hours, they just want to know that you are dealing with it. So the approach is, this is what's happened, this is all we know, we're investigating it, we will come back to you in this period of time. So just in conclusion, when I sort of look at GDPR, there's obviously lots of content around on this kind of stuff. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. For me, the best content, I think, came from, I think it's weirdly the Spanish regulator. And it's a video basically sort of promoting GDPR compliance. It shows two quite attractive people in bed. And the young man is telling his girlfriend about GDPR, and she is getting increasingly excited, as you can imagine. And the tagline at the end is, understanding GDPR is sexy. I'm delighted that none of you have got too excited over this presentation, but it is still sexy. Are we doing questions?
Yep. Sorry. Thank you for that, Michael. So one of the things that I cocked up on the beginning was that I forgot to tell everybody that we can use the hashtag Leeds Hub, and then I'll ask any questions that you have. So has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask? Normally we'll see a few. Here you go.
Could be a really silly one, but I can't quite get my head around it. So say Hubspot and MailChimp, they're American companies. but they're GDPR compliant. So, are you technically sharing your information outside the EEA with that data?
Yeah, so a US company will be worry about it because they're processing data of subjects within the European Union. Whether the data is leaving the European Union will depend on where they're processing the data. So it may be it's processed within the Union, which means it's not leaving. It may be it is to be processed elsewhere. So the answer, you just need to ask the service provider. On Hubspot, do we know the answer?
So we've just announced actually that we have international cloud infrastructure coming from Frankfurt. Excuse me. Anyone get anything? So from Hubspot's perspective, currently data is encrypted and sent to the US. However, later this month, we have international cloud infrastructure from Google's cloud in Frankfurt, which is encrypting and then sending to the US. So that should answer the question there about the data being in the EU.
So it is being sent outside.
It will be encrypted and sent, yes.
Okay, so legally it is leaving the EEA. Even if it's encrypted.
That's correct. So it's going to be encrypted and sent.
I'll come back to you.
Hi. What's not quite clear is sort of reactivating lapsed customers and how long we can do that for. So, say for example in our database, we might want to do some outreach to people that haven't bought from us in 18 months, given that we know our buying cycle can be anything from 12 months to 5 years. And we sell B2B engineered products. So it's a bit of a grey area for me, is that I understand that if somebody unsubscribes, then the right thing for us to do is we probably need to delete them from our records because they're no longer interested. But if it's somebody that's bought our products in the past and we want to sort of re-engage them, where are we on that in terms of compliance?
So your best bet definitely is trying to re-engage before May. So really, in an ideal world, I think you need to work out whether you have a compliant consent for direct marketing or not. If you do, then you can carry on to the direct marketing emails to them regardless. If you don't, then you really want to try and get one. So the best scenario would be try and get consent of as many people as you can before GDPR comes into effect. If that's not practical, or the people that you want to talk to who you haven't got consent for, you're looking at legitimate interest, I think just be a little bit careful on it. So you need to be demonstrating that it's not harming them. In other words, it's relevant to them. So I think it's not perfect if you don't have a consent for some of those types of emails, but I think as long as they are not sort of spamming, not regular, and you're trying to add as much value as possible, then that's probably fine. Grey area.
It also includes the direct sales force. So obviously there's marketing team using Hubspot to email and send out targeted emails, but if a business development manager wanted to reach out to a customer that he knows has been sort of on his radar for a while and not bought, is that still the same thing, or is that legitimate interest?
I think on outreach stuff, I think if you could frame it on a sort of slightly more towards contractual performance, so almost less salesy, much more targeted, then you're much more likely to be able to use legitimate interest as the justification.
Yeah. Any other questions on GDPR? Let's do this all.
You been to the gym yet this morning?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah. You were talking about privacy policies and putting in there what you're doing with the data and how you process them and stuff. What if you get somebody who comes to you and you've sent them, say, an empty basket email from MailChimp, and they sort of complain that you've then sent them this email and they've not read your privacy policy? Where would you stand on that? Is it, do you need to pull their attention to the privacy policy, or is it up to the customer to seek that out in advance?
I mean, you need to make it, you should make it obvious to them, and you should basically provide it to them. I think the MailChimp example almost touched on something else, which is if you're just adding people to a mailing list, you're going to need that consent to do that. So if you don't have that consent in the first place, they shouldn't be on the mailing list, and you're automatically breaching both the current regime and the future regime if you haven't got that consent. if that's all you're doing with them and you're simply providing them direct marketing emails, in a way you don't need them to have access to your privacy policy because you've told them what you're going to do with the email and you've got their consent for it. As long as you can record that, there's an argument to say you don't need them to see the privacy policy. Obviously, if you're going to do other stuff with the data and use it in other ways, then yes, they need to understand what that is so they can see the privacy policy. Just if somebody objects to, when you use something like MailChimp, there's an opt-out at the bottom. If somebody clicks the opt-out, they should drop straight away off the mailing list, so you shouldn't be able to send them a further email. So things like MailChimp do that automatically, but obviously you should never ever send them another email unless they opt back in.
Anyone else?
From an agency perspective, if someone downloads something like a white paper, is that showing interest? Like, in terms of it being relevant to them?
Yeah, so you're absolutely entitled to send them communications that are relevant to targeting. What you probably shouldn't be doing is adding them to the mailing list unless they specifically give consent for that.
Okay. Thank you.
One more? Anyone? No? Okay, so what we're quickly, thank you for that, Michael. Very good always. So what we're going to do is quick coffee, toilet break if anybody needs it, and then Ben's going to jump up and talk us through sales and marketing enablement, alignment. Right, everybody, so we're going to start back with Ben now. So hopefully we'll manage to grab coffee, have a rest break and all that. So Ben is from Hubspot, and he's going to be talking us through sales and marketing plans for 2018. I've seen part of this talk before. It's really kind of good engaging talk, and you'll come away with some great takeaways of how you can implement this stuff in your business. So you'll have to welcome Ben up onto the stage.
Thanks a lot, Richard. You all hear me okay? Excellent. My name's Ben and I lead sales enablement for Hubspot out of Dublin. What does sales enablement mean? The three things I focus a lot of time on are helping sales reps to close deals, ensuring the office hits its quota goal each month and quarter, and the third piece is sales and marketing alignment, making sure these two teams that don't always work close together are working closely together, communicating frequently, and all that kind of stuff. And that's why I'm here today to talk to you about planning your company's marketing and sales for 2018 and beyond. We're going to look at what and why you should be doing these things. I hope many of you are already, but also the how as well. So there'll be lots of practical takeaways. And then if any of you have any questions, there will be Q&A at the end. There's also the Leeds Hub hashtag, so feel free to ask that away. And we'll begin. So, most business leaders today are really tasked with growing the business. But for that to happen, what they need is to be overachieving on their targets. And for that to happen, they need a sales team that is consistently hitting 100% of their quota. And then if we're to back up a little, sales need to be following up with all the leads that marketing is driving. And then to back up again, we need marketing to be hitting their lead generation goals and providing traffic in the first instance. So sales and marketing need to be working closely together. Marketing needs to be generating the traffic, the leads. Sales need to be following up, and that's how you can hit your goals and help your business to grow. So that's really what the talk is about. And yeah, those three aspects in particular. So traffic, leads, and the follow-up. So let's talk about the role of marketing in growth. Going to go back in time a little bit, 1965. The world was a very different place back then. I think Beatles mania was in full flow. Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister. Leeds United were in the top flight. It's a very, very different world back then. There was no internet, and so And generally, the marketing tactics of choice were radio, print, a little bit of TV advertising, those sorts of things. So whilst those tactics worked and worked well back then, in many instances they're becoming less effective today. So whilst we're on the theme of going back in time, I just wanted to talk to you now about a company that used those tactics and channels really, really well back in '65. So here's a letter that was sent by a US-based sports company in Oregon, and they're called Blue Ribbon Sports, if you've heard of them. And they sent this letter to track and field coaches. And basically, I like it for many reasons. It's got all the ingredients, the good marketing, the attention-grabbing start, the social proof, testimonials, all those sorts of things. I don't know if any of you recognise the name at the bottom. The author of the letter is a guy called Phil Knight, and the company Blue Ribbon Sports will become Nike. So whilst I think what we're showing here is Phil knew that if he helped educate the market, tell them about his product and services, he could build demand for those products. So whilst I think the channels and tactics may have changed from '65, those challenges the marketers face, educating, telling about your services and products, and building demand, I think they're universal. So let's move on to the next slide. And I think most people will be very familiar with Nike and their do it, and their great advertising around that. But they've always invested in great content. And what we have here is a leaflet they created. They didn't just send letters, they created leaflets. And this leaflet was wildly successful. It talked about the idea of jogging. And most people today don't think too much about that. But jogging is not a thing in the US in '65. So they created this content, educated their audience, and built demand for their products. So we think this is a fantastic example of early inbound in action. So let's come back to modern day then, 2018. So today, marketers, how many of you are HubSpot users? Many of you. Excellent. So you'll be pretty familiar with the numerous tools that are available in the product to help marketers get their job done. So today, we as marketers have dozens and dozens of tools, which is fantastic. I'm sure Phil Knight would love to have SEO, blogging, web pages, landing pages, social media, all that kind of stuff. So today, marketers have got loads of great tools available. However, many marketers, I'm sure the people in this room, but many marketers, they've, over the years, not been good to the people they've marketed to. People using an outbound, old school approach. And we're seeing a fight back from consumers, really. Marketers have got these great tools, and now people are defending themselves from these great tools. And what I mean by that is, we're seeing things like DVR, so you can skip TV ads, the unsubscribe list. Direct mail goes straight in the bin normally. And then there's also the do not calls. So marketers have these great tools, but consumers are wising up and investing in tools to block out marketing messages. And then there's not just tools, there's actually legislation. 65 days till GDPR comes in. Who's doing ready? So here's the thing. Marketers generally have been bad, and unfortunately legislation and regulations coming in because marketers have been so naughty. So this is the challenge, not faced with marketers. At HubSpot, we feel our product and the inbound methodology has always been on the right side of the GDPR. Our approach is about attracting people with great content and providing such value that they want to opt in and give consent to be contacted and have that relationship. So we always feel as though we've been on the right side. There's some new features products come out later, we'll talk about, but 65 days. I've got a calendar on my desk pointing down to this. So it's sexy, as Michael said earlier. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about inbound versus outbound. So a lot of companies are giving up their outbound playbook. Things like cold calling, spam emails, stuff that interrupts. They're finding it is becoming a lot less impactful. Many marketers, although it sounds like I'm preaching to converted here, they're adopting this inbound approach, and they're finding it's a bit more efficient. They're attracting people with content, it's educating, it's helpful. People actually want to go and receive this stuff. So we think it's fundamentally the right approach. And it's, we think it's the right thing to do. And now we think it's going to be the legal way to do things, but also the results that companies achieve by employing an inbound strategy are really, really impressive. So they generate more leads, they see a higher ROI, and they make bigger savings. So inbound is it's not a more efficient way to do marketing, but it also reflects how people want to search for information and buy services and products today. So this is quite a well-trotted out stat here. But 60% of the sales cycle is over before someone even speaks to the sales rep. So this is huge for people that make content. If you think about it, that's a big opportunity. A big opportunity for marketers to be creating this top of the funnel educational content before someone even speaks with your sales teams. So we think this is a huge hit in that. We'll just take a quick deep dive now on the awareness problems and how to overcome that. So every piece of content that a company makes is an opportunity to be found. There's 3.5 million Google searches each day, so there's tons of opportunities for companies to get found. What they need to be doing, and we recommend our clients do this all the time, I'm sure Richard and the team do too. We advise our clients to think more like media companies, and some of our clients, they might find that almost a bit scary initially, but it doesn't need to be overly difficult. If you have product experts at your company, book an hour with them, bring a dictaphone, go and get the notes typed up on rev.com, and you can have pages and pages of interesting, valuable content you can turn into blogs, webinars, ebooks, that kind of stuff. So, and here's a piece of research we conducted. We found, although quality clearly is hugely important, when companies double down on content, invest heavily in the process and do it consistently, once you hit about between 50 and 100 published blog posts, often you pick up this long-tail traffic. And that's really where you start to see that hockey stick growth generate huge volume of leads. So clearly quality is really, really important. But there's also, once you hit a certain number of high quality published blog posts, you see great returns. So let's talk about conversions. So what's a conversion, guys? Anyone like to hazard a guess? I like it. Any advances on that? Anyone? Maybe come to customer. I like it. It's here's how we're thinking about it at Hubspot. It kind of touches upon what both of you said. So we think conversion is when a company, in the first instance, provides something of value to somebody. So historically, when we spoke about this, it often meant content, but increasingly, we're also talking about free products as well. So we think businesses have to provide value initially, and then in exchange for that value, once they've given that value to the person, that's when you want them to opt in, give you their email address, plus the consent, which is so important. So here's the thing. customers, they don't want to feel like they're part of the crowd. They need content tailored to them at each stage of the buyer's journey. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that idea, but it's often overlooked. As I'm sure you know, they all have different goals and challenges and need tailored content aligned to that. So let's talk about revenue. So, who works closely with a sales team here? Who has a good relationship with their sales team here? This is good, this is better than the last talk I did. So, speak to your sales team and what's the one thing they need, especially if they're growing, increasing headcount, that kind of stuff. They're going to need more high quality leads. And here's the advice we give many of our clients and agencies. Sales and marketing teams need to shift their focus really from it's often outbound, old school playbook to inbound. And it's simple, but it's not always easy. Inbound is this process. You need to commit time, energy, resources to build the content, get the workflows going, that kind of stuff. So it's not easy. I think many people we speak to, they want to buy something and instantly see these results overnight. It's not quite like that. You need to commit and build great content. You'll see there's fantastic agencies like Richard's which can help you out with that. So let's talk about the role of sales in growth. Today, the buyer has all the power. What we really mean by this is the old way of sales, the seller really had all the power. Today, buyers can speak with their friends, online, social media, search engines, review sites. With all these great resources, they can go and find out about your products and services before they can go and speak with sales. So they're incredibly educated and empowered, which is not always the case. Historically, certainly in the old world of kind of enterprise on-premise software, the seller had all the power. This has changed. We think this is really, really good for buyers. So, but this probably isn't news to you. We're all modern buyers. So that shouldn't be a surprise. But what probably is surprising, Hubspot is really, really good at helping companies to modernize their marketing. We have lots of success with that. But the challenge we often find still is we have a marketing team that's doing great work within that, but the sales part of the business have not modernized their approach. They have sort of this legacy approach to sales. Does that resonate with anyone? Marketing have adopted this inbound approach, handing it over to sales, not quite sure what they're up to. I see a few heads nodding. Nice opportunity here for you, Richard. So yeah, this is fairly common. This is really, really common. But HubSpot and our partners are here to help that change. Lots of interesting stuff coming on the sales side. So, what do we mean by this old school outbound playbook that sales still in many cases follow? What we mean, they want to qualify and close prospect as soon as possible. They're not providing value or education about the sales process. The next one, using purchase demographic data. Obviously, come 25th of May, this will be outlawed and given consent. But it's possible to buy lists. Many companies do. There is some interesting data, but if people haven't opted in to receive email from you, it's very unlikely to reply. Once the GDPR comes in, we'll no longer do that anyway. And really, this kind of sales is all about applying brute force and generic messaging, generic case studies, generic demos, blah, blah, blah. So, we think this playbook is changing, and HubSpot is excited about helping you and your sales organizations to modernize. So, yeah, the same old tactics just don't work. And most sales organizations today are extremely data-driven. So they see these tactics are becoming less and less impactful. What do they go and do? they find ways to increase their activity level, often with automation. So they again increase their throughput. So they see stuff is becoming less impactful, so they get increased activity level. I think this chart shows it pretty nicely. So what we have here along the bottom is people replying to sales. There's an incremental increase, but what we have up there is an exponential amount of activity. So this is although this is theoretical, this is fairly common. Sales see their approaches becoming less impactful, so they get automate things to make up for the shortfall. But as the chart shows, doing more of something that is broken is not a good approach. So yeah, turns out you can't automate crappy sales and marketing. So yeah, I've spoken a little bit about how marketing contributes to growth and how sales is to be modernised. Spoke about them individually, but I'll talk more about how they work together collectively. We'll also, here's the thing, we talk about sales and marketing working much more closely, but the reality is often they don't get on that well. It can be miscommunication, mistrust, misunderstandings between the two. Does this sound familiar to anyone's business? So yeah, these two teams often don't get on as well as we'd like them to. If they're not on the same page, it causes trouble. We'll change gears slightly now and have a quick game of true and false and try and look at some of those misconceptions between sales and marketing. A lot of marketers here today. So yeah, there's a misconception that all sales reps are salesmen. Some marketers think about sales, they're only themselves, really self-centered, not team players, that kind of stuff. It's false, this one, just to confirm. Instead, if you go and speak with a sales rep, often there's this higher goal. They're much more interested in money. They might be planning for a family, saving for their home, their dream holiday. So, true or false, this one? This one is true. Marketing stand now. Common misconception is so sales often say about marketing, they're just doing arts and crafts, they're perfecting the ultimate suite or coming up with Photoshop image or perfect copy. This one, as I'm sure you all know, is false. Instead, marketers today are more akin to a data scientist. And what we mean by this is the best marketers today know the value of data, they use it to inform their decision making and build their strategies. So this one is true. Marketers are all about the data. But what we find is, even when we speak to sales and marketing teams, what's often happening is there's miscommunication going on. And we see these sorts of things all the time. We have sales reps telling us we don't have enough leads from marketing, and even the ones they send us aren't any good. And then from the marketing side, we give sales plenty of leads. They just don't follow up quickly enough. So here's the thing. There is one big takeaway, and it's not an easy thing to do, but it is really, really important. It's the importance of sales and marketing alignment. So companies, the Aberdeen Group did some great research, so companies that have strong sales and marketing alignment, they see a 20% annual growth rate, which is absolutely huge. And then conversely, those which have poor sales and marketing alignment see 4% decline. So whilst 4% may not sound huge, when you consider the 20% advantage that you could have in sales and marketing alignment, this becomes really, really significant. So the question becomes, how can these two tribes work more closely together? I haven't just made up a word. Someone got there about 10 years ago. At Hubspot, we talk a lot about smarketing, and that's our internal phrase for sales and marketing alignment. But what we really mean about this is three things, and I think it's applicable to all businesses, is sales and marketing need to communicate frequently, have shared goals and an SLA, but also hold each other accountable. Many businesses, marketing as a lead goal, and that's half the step. The second part is sales following up, but also being held accountable. Do any of you have an SLA to provide to your sales team each month? Give a lead goal. Few hands. For those that have a lead goal each month, does sales have to reciprocate? Do they have to follow up at a certain time or with a certain depth? Or is it kind of a one-way agreement? Few heads. That's fairly typical. Marketing has this lead goal to hit, and sales do not reciprocate. And that's really half the challenge in many cases. So here's a quick overview of things we'd advise you and your sales org to be doing. To create sales and marketing alignment, we need this common language. What we mean is everyone understands what the terminology is that they're using. What's a lead? What's a visitor? What's a contact? What's a conversion? That kind of stuff. To set up the process, and then also have the tools in place to track everything and keep everyone accountable. So let's kick off and talk about common language. This is the fundamental, I think, of sales and marketing alignment. Everyone understanding what everything is. And we have the example here of an MQL, a marketing qualified lead. What does that mean? What we'd say to our clients is sit down with sales and work out what the various skill stages are. Ensure everyone knows what the terminology is to sit to. The next thing is defining the life cycle stages. This is a typical funnel. So if your prospect or visitor comes to your website, they complete a form, then they're handed over to sales and become a customer. This is good, but it's not great. We think there's lots of gaps here and grey areas and potential for misunderstandings here. So what we advise companies to do is have a life cycle stage that looks something more like this. We think there's more detail needed. So just to talk you through this, a prospect or visitor will come to your website, download a piece of content and become a lead, but we still think there's a piece of work to be done, to be nurtured. So marketing owns the marketing qualified lead, the MQL, and over time, that will be sent over to Hubspot in any way. The business development reps, BDRs, or SDR, which is a sales development rep. And they're going to qualify out those leads, and eventually, if they're a good fit, they'll be handed over to sales and become an opportunity. And then sales will work it to become a customer. So while this may not be right for every business, we think it's a really good place to start. We think the sales process needs that level of granularity. So what I've just described is the kind of the conventional content playbook. I think this is also applicable to chatbots as well and stuff like that, and conversations. But it just enables people to go through it much more quickly. So, an SLA, service level agreement. contract between the service provider and the end user. It defines what the provider is going to do and the end user as well. This is really, really important. Let's have a show of hands. Who has an SLA with their sales order? Who thinks they should have one with their sales order? A few more hands. So here's how we have our marketing and sales SLA at Hubspot. So the marketing team each month commits to providing a certain volume of leads to a particular quality, and then sales needs to commit to following up within a certain depth within a certain time. And it's bi-directional, so both teams need to hold each other accountable. And the other really important thing about this is the SLA evolves over time. As new products are launched or competitors enter the market or increase headcount or growth goals, you need to adjust the SLA to that. So we're going to take a quick look now at planning your sales and marketing for 2018 and beyond. We're going to look at the first step, which is determining the business growth, how to calculate the marketing SLA, and then the sales SLA, and then we'll look at reporting for both. So before marketing and sales calculate their SLA, they need to speak with the business leadership and understand the revenue goal for the year. It all starts from that. So if you have a new revenue goal of £1 million for the year ahead, and the average sales price is £10,000, you know that you're going to need 100 new customers in the year ahead. So this is the starting point for your sales and marketing SLA. So if your new customer goal is 100 customers for the year, but your leads to customer close rate, so how many of those leads do you close, is 20%. You know marketing's going to need to provide 500 leads for that year. We don't have a calculation or a formula here. We just have some research from our friends at Inside Sales. It's easy for marketing to work out how many leads they provide. Sales needs to respond quickly to leads. This is really, really important. And getting there first matters. So as soon as you guys create the leads for your sales team and they're handed over, sales need to follow up quickly. What is quick is a good question. It depends on your industry, the buying cycle of your customers, and also your company. For HubSpot, quick is about 5 minutes. So when these hot leads go to sales, they need to follow up really, really quickly. The person that gets there first often wins. So it's in everyone's interest to win. So this is the marketing SLA report. We call this a waterfall. You can kind of see how it looks a bit like a waterfall. What we see here is the blue line is performance, and then the orange line is the goal. Ideally, you want them to be perfectly aligned. You'll see at the start here, marketing was underperforming. That's obviously really bad. Not enough leads for sales, so the sales reps not utilising their time. But also, if it's too far above the orange line, that's also inefficient because sales won't know which leads to follow up with or how they won't know to do it with. So you need to be perfectly aligned. And that's what you should keep a close eye on and set up this waterfall report. And then for the sales SLA reporting side, you need to keep a close eye on how quickly reps are following up into what depth. As I say, it's very, very easy for sales to look at how marketing is performing and hold us accountable for that, as marketers need to be doing the same for sales. So that's really the overview. We can talk about planning the sales and marketing for 2018 and beyond. There's 4 key takeaways really. So the first one is really, especially with GDPR coming up, marketers need to follow focus on attracting people, earning the right to contact with them rather than interrupting. So not only are interruptive tactics becoming less impactful, but they're going to be in many instances outlawed. That shared language, so understanding each stage, the buyer's journey and the sales cycle, to go and speak with your sales team, get that defined, make sure everyone understands what they're talking about. That will help eliminate the grey areas, miscommunications, that kind of stuff. And then create an SLA. That's really, really important, and very few companies actually have this SLA between sales and marketing. But if you get that running, work more closely with sales, it'll get rid of many of the misunderstandings, and you'll see the results. And the last one is defining those metrics so you can keep everyone accountable. So that concludes the talk today about planning your sales and marketing. Hope it's been interesting. We can have a few more questions now, I think, Richard.
Thank you for that, Ben. So I'm going to start the questions just because I've got a couple here. So there's a lot of marketers and salespeople in the room, and you've given us some key takeaways. From a sales perspective, what's the one thing that they should do leaving this room to start an alignment process in their organisation? And also, for marketers, what's one thing that both sides can do to get this process started?
I think the common language and defining deal stages, so everyone understands at what point marketing hands over the lead to sales. Get understanding around that. Often it's a case of, okay, here's all the leads we've generated, we don't know what happens to them, sales is doing something with them, and marketing aren't really holding sales accountable around that. And often it feels like they can fall into this kind of black hole. Marketing hands over to sales, they don't know what happens. And really, that needs to change. So understanding the SLA, who owns what, and the language.
And also, what's Hubspot doing in terms of the product with GDPR?
This week we've announced our product roadmap. We don't typically announce our roadmap, but we know GDPR 65 days away. It's a really hot topic. So we've made some changes to our product to help clients in their path compliance. So we feel our product and the inbound methodology has always been on the right side of the GDPR. We help people get traffic and earn attention, and have these forms where people give consent. We're making some changes to our product to make that even easier. And there's some things around on the contact record that we'll be able to track what type of consent message the person saw, when they saw it, and stuff like that. So there's several features coming, and we'll publish them on the website.
Perfect. Other questions for Ben?
I work for a really small company, so we're a startup as well. So in terms of organic visibility, obviously we don't have a lot at the moment. I totally understand, because I work in sales and marketing as both of those people, that finding our things is not going to be very easy. So if I wrote a white paper on SEO, for example, it may not be visible to a lot of people. So the way that I would supplement that is by doing the old school outbound cold calling. I understand that that's not the best way to go about it, and content is always going to win over, but how would you get your content out to people if it's not an outbound reach?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's several approaches you can take to promote your content. You could put some paid social behind it, some spell that. You could do some link building, things like that.
Yeah.
Social sharing as well. Sharing it out to your existing database. So there's 4 pretty solid approaches you can take there.
Okay, thank you.
Next question?
Just a really quick one. What's happening with the customer hub?
kind of very simple. There's
So
some,
it's in December.
I'm actually working very closely with our go-to-market team on it. So we're building a fantastic product. We'll be launching, and yeah, we're very excited about it. There'll be a big splash when it's ready to go. But we see that as our product really. It's been a really good marketing product. We've got this really good sales product plus the CRM. But what happens when someone becomes a customer? So we think this is another strand to the product. It's really, really important. And also having that one unified view from the contact records, which is pretty rare. So you'll be able to see when this person became a lead, all the conversations the sales rep had, and now any discussions we've had with your service and support team. So we're really excited. We're pleased to hear a few more people are as well. Are you a partner? Sorry, are you a partner?
No.
Just what is they're starting to like parts of the customer hub. They're starting to release bits of it into beta now. So like there are bits that we're starting to be allowed to play with. I did. Any other questions? Not going to maybe run to this other room. I had one question for you that came through on social. It was around cookies. So you know when you visit the site, you get the pop-up red bright. Are they still in the room? Are they gone? Anyone? Okay. So when you go to a website, you get a cookie pop-up saying I consent or whatever. Is that process going to change at all come GDPR? Is it going to have to be more explicit or don't need it anymore?
GDPR shouldn't impact it particularly. The updates that you've previously may change it, but they haven't been much yet.
Okay.
My instance is probably not much.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. Thank you everybody for coming to the first Leeds Hub this year. So the plan, like as I alluded to, thank you very much for that, Dan, as well. Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, the plan for Leeds is to hold these physical events at least quarterly. The next one is going to be on June 6th. It'll be here again. The idea is that we have this kind of digital presence. We can all kind of hang out, we'll get some good speakers in. But also I want to have that digital presence as well. Like we can use it partially like an agony aunt place if we need to, but also like we're like as partners we're going to start sharing news around things like from the customer hub and those kind of elements are starting to be released. So it'll give us a bit more of a community. Hopefully that's my plan. You're going to get a couple of, I'd like to say they're personal emails, but they have been automated. You're going to get a bunch of emails kind of saying like, how did you find the event? Great to get feedback. It's not me kind of asking for a bunch of stuff to make you feel better about stuff. It's literally, we'd like to make these events as best as possible. So we can ask you about the species, we can ask you about the venue, all that kind of stuff. Should take no more longer than a minute to fill in, so if you could, I'd really appreciate it. But other than that, thanks for coming. Really appreciate it.